The gunshot cracked through the winter air like breaking bone, sending passengers screaming and diving for cover behind the train cars. Cassie Ruthwell clutched her carpetbag against her chest, frozen on the platform as acrid smoke drifted past her face. Through the chaos, she saw him, a lean man in expensive clothes, stepping through the crowd like he owned every inch of ground beneath his boots. "And now that I have everyone's attention," Dexter Harlan called out, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about who belongs to whom in this town." His eyes found Cassie, instantly pale blue and predatory. She'd never seen him before, but she knew that face. It had haunted her dreams for 3 months after he'd failed to meet her at the Kansas City depot, leaving her stranded and humiliated with nothing but broken promises and a handful of love letters that now felt like poison in her pocket. "You." He pointed directly at her, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Fat girl with the sad eyes. You're coming with me." The Beckett family stood in a tight cluster 20 feet away, their faces twisted with disgust as they looked her up and down. Martha Beckett, her intended groom's sister-in-law, spat in the snow. "That's what Silas was supposed to marry. Look at the size of her. No wonder she had to come out here as a mail-order bride." But it was the station master's next action that truly trapped her. He approached with what should have been her return ticket. Every bride's lifeline home glanced at Harlan, then deliberately fed the paper into the pot-bellied stove. The flames consumed it with a hungry hiss. "Oops," he said, not meeting her eyes. Harlan's men began closing in, 6 of them, moving with the coordinated precision of a wolf pack. Cassie could smell the whiskey on their breath, see the casual violence in their swagger. These weren't men who took no for an answer. "I don't know you," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Oh, but I know you, Miss Cassie Ruthwell of Cincinnati, Ohio. Daughter of Thomas Ruthwell, the troublesome schoolteacher." His smile widened. "We have so much to discuss." The mention of her father's name hit like a physical blow. Papa had been dead 6 years, lynched by a Missouri mob for reasons she'd never fully understood. What could this stranger possibly know about that tragedy? "Leave me alone. I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, you and I have unfinished business. 3 months of correspondence, promises made, arrangements to honor." He gestured to his men. "Boys, escort Miss Ruthwell to the buggy. Gently now. We don't want to damage the merchandise." That's when the second voice cut through the tension like a blade. "She's not going anywhere." A man stepped out of the crowd, tall, weathered, with the kind of calloused hands that spoke of honest work and the kind of eyes that had seen too much grief. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that violence could erupt without warning. "Silas Beckett." Harlan said, his tone shifting to something almost amused. "I should have known you'd stick your nose where it doesn't belong. She's my intended bride. That makes it my business." "Your intended bride." Harlan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "This woman belongs to me. Have for months. Check your mail more carefully next time before you go shopping for other men's property." Silas looked at Cassie for the first time, really looked at her. And she saw something in his expression that wasn't the disgust she'd expected. Curiosity, maybe. Or recognition of something familiar, the particular exhaustion that came from having the world repeatedly try to break you. "Is that true?" he asked her directly. Cassie felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every cruel laugh. She thought about her father, about the courage it had taken him to stand up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. She thought about the letters in her bag, the lies and promises and careful manipulation that had brought her to this frozen moment. "No," she said. "It's not true." Harlan's face darkened. "You lying?" But Silas was already moving, stepping between them with the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down wolves and rustlers and the endless brutality of frontier life. Then I guess we have nothing more to discuss. He looked at Cassie. Ma'am, I'm offering you marriage and a home if you want them. No strings, no obligations beyond what you choose to give. What do you say? It wasn't poetry. It wasn't romance. But it was more than anyone else had offered her in years, and infinitely better than whatever Harlan had planned. I say yes. Harlan's hand dropped to his gun, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats made him hesitate. More townspeople were gathering, drawn by the commotion, and even a man with his influence couldn't afford to start a war in broad daylight with 50 witnesses. This isn't over, he said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of violence. Not by a long shot. As his men melted back into the crowd, Silas helped Cassie into his wagon. But she could feel Harlan's eyes on her back, like the touch of cold steel. And she knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever had brought her to Lawless Gap was far from finished. The wagon lurched into motion, carrying her away from the station and toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the train pulled away in a cloud of steam and regret, taking with it any possibility of return. Cassie Ruthwell was committed now, for better or worse, to whatever came next. The farmhouse sat in the shadow of Devil's Ridge, like a fortress against the world's smoke rising from its chimney into the steel-gray sky. As Silas helped her down from the wagon, Cassie could hear children's voices from inside, one high and sweet, the other barely a whisper. "Samuel, Emma," Silas called. "Come meet Miss Cassie." The little girl appeared first, a sprite with wheat-colored hair and eyes like her father's, blue as deep water, old beyond her 5 years. She hung back, thumb in mouth, studying Cassie with the intensity only children possessed. The boy took longer to emerge. 8 years old and thin as a rail, with the careful movements of someone who'd learned that the world could hurt you when you least expected it. He clutched a wooden horse against his chest like armor. "Hello," Cassie said, crouching to their level despite her aching knees. "I'm very pleased to meet you both." Emma mumbled something around her thumb. Samuel said nothing at all. "They're still adjusting to strangers," Silas explained. "It's been just the 3 of us since Lucy passed." The house told the story of a woman's absence in 100 small ways. Dust on the windowsills mending left unfinished in a basket, a child's dress hanging on a peg that was clearly too small for its owner. Lucy Beckett had been loved here, and her ghost still walked every room. She was wonderful. Silas said quietly, following Cassie's gaze to a portrait on the mantel, a tiny woman with kind eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Everything a wife and mother should be. The implication hung in the air, unlike you. But Cassie had stopped expecting the world to coddle her feelings years ago. She set her bag down and rolled up her sleeves. What needs doing? Over the next hours, she learned the rhythm of the household. Emma showed her where Lucy had kept the cooking spices, where she'd mended clothes by the window overlooking the garden that was now buried under snow. Samuel remained silent, but accepted the peppermint stick she offered from her traveling provisions. They were just sitting down to a dinner of beans and cornbread when the knock came. Silas tensed immediately, his hand moving toward the rifle above the fireplace, expecting someone. Not at this hour. The knock came again, more insistent. Through the window, Cassie could see a young man on the porch, barely out of his teens, with nervous eyes, and the kind of clothes that marked him as a town boy rather than a farmer. "Mr. Beckett got a letter for the lady. Mr. Harlan said to deliver it tonight, no matter the hour." Silas took the envelope, studying the expensive paper and elegant script. After the messenger disappeared into the darkness, he handed it to Cassie. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she recognized with a sick jolt of memory. The same hand that had written her months of love letters, promises of happiness, descriptions of the life they'd build together. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope. "My dear Cassidy, your performance at the station was quite impressive, but ultimately pointless. You belong to me by prior arrangement, and I intend to honor that commitment, whether you wish it or not. You have 48 hours to present yourself at my ranch alone, or I will be forced to take measures that will bring considerable hardship to your current hosts. The children are particularly vulnerable, don't you think? Such a shame when accidents happen to little ones. You know what you are. You know what I'm capable of. Don't test me. Eternally yours, D. Harlan. Cassie read it twice, her hands shaking with rage rather than fear. She looked up to find Silas watching her intently. Well, she handed him the letter and watched his face darken as he read. When he finished, he folded it carefully and set it on the table. What prior arrangement? The children were listening now, both aware that something was wrong. Cassie chose her words carefully. He courted me through letters for 3 months. Made promises, then vanished when I arrived in Kansas City to meet him. I thought he'd simply changed his mind, but this... She gestured to the letter. This suggests something else entirely. What can he actually do legally? I don't know. I don't know anything about the law out here. Cassie felt exhaustion settling into her bones. I don't even know why he wants me, if he couldn't be bothered to meet me in the first place. Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Dexter Harlan owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties. He's got the sheriff in his pocket, half the town council on his payroll, and enough money to make problems disappear permanently. Then what do you suggest? We ignore him. You're my wife now, at least on paper. That has to count for something. But even as he said it, Cassie could see the doubt in his eyes. And outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like fingers trying to get in. Emma started crying. Then a soft, heartbroken sound that seemed to sum up everything wrong with the world. Without thinking, Cassie gathered the little girl into her arms, surprised when Emma didn't pull away. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured. "Everything's going to be all right." She hoped she wasn't lying. The harassment began the next morning, swift and surgical in its precision. Cassie woke to find their milk cow dead in the pasture, its throat cut, blood steaming in the snow. Worse, someone had painted "whore" across their barn door in letters 3 feet tall, visible from the main road. Silas stood staring at the carnage, his shoulders bowed with defeat. "We should leave. Pack up and head west before this gets worse." "With what money?" Cassie asked practically. "We can barely afford to eat." "Then what?" She looked at the ugly word on their barn, at the waste of good meat they couldn't afford to lose, at this man who was ready to surrender everything rather than fight. "We clean up this mess and get on with our lives." The attacks escalated daily. Their fence line was cut in 3 places, cattle scattered across neighboring property. The blacksmith suddenly couldn't find parts for their broken plow. The general store claimed to be out of flour and coffee, though Cassie could see supplies stacked behind the counter. "They're starving us out," Silas said grimly, examining the latest damage. But the isolation was worse than the material losses. The other women in town crossed the street rather than acknowledge her existence. Children threw stones when she walked to the well. Even the preacher looked through her on Sundays like she was made of smoke. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when Cassie discovered their house had been searched during the night. Nothing stolen but her belongings rifled through her letters scattered across the floor. Most disturbing, Emma's rag doll hung by its neck from the kitchen rafters. Emma's screams when she saw it echoed off the walls like something dying. The little girl was convinced whoever had hurt her doll was coming back for her next, and no amount of reassurance could calm her terror. "That's it." Silas said, his voice deadly quiet as he cut down the mutilated toy. "We're leaving tonight." "No. And look around you. Look what they're doing to us, to the children. Look at what you're teaching them," Cassie shot back. "That the answer to bullying is to run. That if someone bigger and meaner wants to hurt you, your only choice is surrender. Better alive and running than dead and noble." Are we living now? Really? All her frustration boiled over. We're prisoners in our own home, too afraid to go to town, too afraid to send the children to school. How is that living? Silas had no answer, so he did what he always did. When faced with difficult emotions, he walked away. But Cassie had had enough of silence and submission. She followed him to the barn. "What are you so afraid of?" He spun around his composure, finally cracking. "I'm afraid of losing everything again. I already failed." Lucy was too busy working to notice how sick she was getting. "I won't fail my children, too." "You didn't fail, Lucy. Consumption isn't something you fight with stubbornness. But this is. This is something I can control if I just give Harlan what he wants. What happens to me?" The question hung between them like a blade. Silas looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "You'd sacrifice me to save your children." "You're not my responsibility, they are." The words hit like a physical blow. She'd known their marriage was one of convenience, but she'd let herself hope she might matter to him even a little. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'm not your responsibility. But I'm not your sacrifice either." That night, while Silas slept and the children dozed fitfully after hours of nightmares, Cassie sat at the kitchen table and began to write. Not surrender to Dexter Harlan, but war. Letters to the territorial marshal, to newspapers beyond Harlan's influence, to anyone who might listen to the story of a murdered schoolteacher and his daughter's fight for justice. She was nobody, as Silas had made clear. But nobody was exactly who could ask questions that somebody might not want answered. Outside, she could swear she heard hoofbeats circling their property like wolves around a dying fire. Let them come. She wasn't running anymore. The revelation came from Henrik the blacksmith, appearing at their door 3 days later, with guilt written across his weathered face. "I need to speak with you about your father." Cassie's blood turned to ice. "My father?" "Thomas Ruthwell. He was your father, the teacher who died in Missouri." Inside, Henrik's hands shook as he pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. But this version was different. Someone had circled words in pencil, made notes in the margins. At the bottom, a signature that made her stomach drop. D. Harlan. "Now, where did you get this?" "I was shoeing horses for Harlan back then." Young man just starting his spread, but already throwing money around like he owned the territory. Henrik's accent thickened with emotion. "He came to my shop the day after your father died, drunk and bragging. Showed me this newspaper, told me how he'd solved a problem down in Missouri." Silas leaned forward. "What kind of problem?" "Your father discovered something about Harlan's land claim. The deed to his ranch was forged. He'd been squatting on government land for years, claiming it through false papers. Your father had the real documentation, was going to turn it over to the territorial authorities." The room spun. Papa never mentioned Dexter Harlan, because he probably didn't know the man personally. But Harlan knew about him. Tracked him down, organized that mob, made sure the teacher who could destroy him never got the chance to talk. "You're saying Harlan killed my father." "I'm saying Harlan paid to have your father killed. And when you wrote to him, when you told him who you were." Henrik shook his head. He must have seen it as divine providence. The daughter of the man who'd threatened him delivered right into his hands. Pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. "He never intended to marry me. Marriage would have been perfect legal right to control everything you do, everywhere you go, everyone you talk to. When that failed," Henrik gestured helplessly. "Plan B, harassment, intimidation, legal pressure." Silas stood abruptly. "We have to get you out of here. Tonight." "No." Cassie's voice was steady, but inside she felt like she was falling. "This changes nothing. Are you insane? He murdered your father? Then I guess I'd better figure out how to prove it." But her confidence was shattered the next morning when Sheriff Morrison arrived with 6 armed men, all wearing expressions that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Silas Beckett, you're under arrest for cattle theft." "What cattle theft?" 20 head of prime beef gone missing from the Harlan Ranch. Witnesses saw you driving them toward the creek yesterday." It was elegant in its simplicity. As Morrison's men searched their property, they quickly found what had been planted, a running iron for altering brands, still warm from recent use. "Well, well," Morrison said with satisfaction. Looks like we got ourselves a rustler. That's not mine. Silas protested, but they all knew how it looked. As the deputies moved to arrest him, Emma began crying. Samuel pressed against the doorframe, eyes wide with terror. Cassie felt something break apart in her chest. "Wait," she said. Morrison's attention swiveled like a snake, focusing on prey. "Well, if it ain't the famous mail-order bride, this is about me, isn't it?" "Don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Morrison smiled coldly. "My job is enforcing the law against rustlers." He gestured to his men. "Take him." As they wrestled Silas toward their horses, Morrison wasn't finished. "Oh, about those children. Territorial law says orphans can't be left with unsuitable guardians. We'll be taking them to the orphanage in Bitter Creek." "No." Cassie lunged forward, but deputies caught her arms. "They're not orphans. You're an unmarried woman of questionable character harboring stolen property. Judge Hendricks has already signed the papers." Emma was screaming, reaching for Cassie with desperate hands. Samuel had gone completely silent, his face white as paper. "You got 1 hour to collect their things," Morrison announced. "Then we take them willing or not." As the sheriff's party rode away with Silas, Cassie sank to her knees in the snow. The children clung to her, while her mind raced through increasingly desperate options. She could run, but winter was coming hard. She had no money, and 2 small children would never survive the journey to safety. She could surrender, present herself at Harlan's ranch, and hope for mercy. But she knew better than to trust a man who'd orchestrated her father's murder, or she could fight, with what remained to be seen. "Emma Samuel," she said gently, "I need you to help me with something very important." They nodded, trusting her completely, despite everything falling apart. "We're going to save your papa and stay together as a family. But first, we need to make sure some very important people know exactly what's happening here." She thought of the letters still sitting on the kitchen table unsent, because she'd been afraid of making things worse. Things couldn't get much worse now. As she gathered paper and ink, hoofbeats approached again, a single rider this time, moving slowly. Through the window, she could see it was one of Harlan's men, and he was carrying something that looked horribly like a noose. The message was clear, time was running out. But then she noticed something else. Smoke rising from the direction of town, too much smoke, too black. Something was burning, and from the panicked shouts carrying on the wind, it wasn't a controlled fire. Whatever was happening might be exactly the distraction she needed. The Harvest Festival had been Lawlessness Gap's biggest celebration for 15 years, a 3-day affair that brought together ranchers and farmers from across the territory. This year, it was also providing perfect cover for Dexter Harlan's final gambit. Cassie rode into town with the children pressed close beside her, the air thick with smoke from what had been the grain warehouse. Half the volunteer fire brigade was battling the blaze, while the other half worked to prevent it from spreading to the church and schoolhouse. In the chaos, no one paid attention to one more desperate woman with 2 frightened children. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity standing room, only buzzing with the kind of energy that preceded either justice or a lynching. Judge Hendricks sat on the bench like a nervous bird, constantly glancing toward the back of the room where Dexter Harlan held court with his usual confident smile. "Your Honor," Cassie said, standing before anyone could stop her. "I have evidence that needs to be presented." "Sit down," Hendricks snapped. "You have no standing." "I have standing as the wife of the accused and as the daughter of Thomas Ruthwell." A ripple went through the crowd at her father's name. In the back, she saw Harlan's smile falter slightly. Thomas Ruthwell was lynched 6 years ago in Missouri by a mob organized by Dexter Harlan. Murdered because he discovered that Mr. Harlan's land claims are based on forged documents. The courtroom erupted. Hendricks banged his gavel, but Cassie wasn't finished. "I have my father's journal documenting his investigation. I have correspondence proving Harlan's involvement. I have testimony from witnesses. And this is outrageous." Harlan was on his feet, face flushed with rage. "Your Honor, this woman is clearly delusional." "Am I?" Cassie pulled out the bundle of letters. Then whose handwriting is this? Whose signature is on love letters promising marriage? But her moment of triumph was shattered by a voice from the crowd, one she'd trusted, one that now cut through her like a blade. She's lying. Henrik stepped forward, his face grim but determined. I never told her anything about Harlan or her father. The woman's been trying to get me to make false statements for weeks. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Cassie stared at the old blacksmith, the man she'd counted as her only ally, and saw the truth in his eyes. He'd been bought just like everyone else. Or Henrik, you know that's not true. What I know is that you're a desperate woman trying to destroy a good man's reputation. His voice carried clearly through the packed room. Mr. Harlan's been nothing but patient with your delusions. The crowd's mood shifted instantly, murmurs of anger replacing sympathy. Cassie felt the walls closing in as Harlan's smile returned wider than ever. Your Honor, he said smoothly, I think we've heard enough from this disturbed woman. Perhaps she should be examined by a doctor before she makes any more wild accusations. That's when the real surprise came. The courthouse doors burst open, and Samuel Beckett walked in. Not the frightened, silent boy she knew, but someone transformed by desperate courage. In his small hands, he carried a leather satchel that looked achingly familiar. Mama Cassie isn't lying, he said, his voice carrying with surprising strength. I have Papa Thomas's real papers. The courtroom fell silent. Samuel walked to the front, his wooden horse tucked under one arm and the satchel held protectively against his chest. Before Mama Lucy died, she told me stories about the box hidden in the old oak tree. She said Mama Cassie's papa left something there for safekeeping, something important. He looked directly at Harlan. Something that would prove who the real land belongs to. Cassie's heart nearly stopped. Lucy had hidden evidence all along. Samuel opened the satchel with careful hands and pulled out a thick folder of official documents, maps, and most damning of all, a signed confession from a man named Joseph Webb, the forger who'd created Harlan's false land deeds. Mama Lucy said to keep it safe until someone brave enough came along to use it right. He looked at Cassie with eyes full of trust. She said Mama Cassie would be brave enough. Harlan's face had gone white. Those are forgeries, obviously planted by a dead woman and an 8-year-old boy. The new voice belonged to Marshal Tom Bradley, who stepped through the crowd with federal deputies flanking him. Mr. Harlan, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder mail fraud and violation of federal homestead laws. But Harlan wasn't finished. As the deputies moved forward, he drew a gun from beneath his coat, his face twisted with rage and desperation. You think you've won something, he snarled at Cassie. You fat, worthless. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, but it wasn't Harlan who fired. Silas stood in the doorway, smoking rifle in his hands, his face set in grim lines. The federal marshal had freed him just minutes earlier, and he'd arrived in time to see Harlan threaten his family. Harlan dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder blood, seeping through his expensive shirt. Around him, his men were surrendering to federal deputies, their loyalty apparently not extending to actual gunfire. It's over, Marshal Bradley announced. Dexter Harlan, you're under arrest. As they led Harlan away in chains, he looked back at Cassie one final time. This isn't over. You think the law protects people like you. I think, Cassie said simply, that the truth protects people like me. And sometimes that's enough. The aftermath rippled through Lawless Gap like stones dropped in still water. Sheriff Morrison fled rather than face federal questioning. Judge Hendricks resigned in disgrace. The grain warehouse fire, it turned out, had been another of Harlan's distractions meant to keep the townspeople occupied while he dealt with the problem of Cassie Ruthwell. But the real changes were smaller, more personal. Henrik appeared at their door a week later, his face heavy with shame. I came to explain, he said quietly. You don't owe me an explanation, Cassie replied. You owe me an apology. He had my grandson. Said he'd hurt the boy if I didn't. Henrik's voice broke. I'm not proud of what I did. Where's your grandson now? Safe. The marshal found him locked in Harlan's ranch house, scared but unharmed. Cassie looked at this broken old man, this grandfather who'd betrayed everything he believed in to protect a child, and felt her anger dissolve into something approaching understanding. Fear makes people do terrible things, she said finally. But you helped save him in the end. Samuel showed real courage bringing those papers to court. The boy knew what his mother had hidden. Lucy was smarter than any of us realized. She must have suspected something about Harlan's land claims, found my father's evidence, and kept it safe until the right moment. It wasn't the whole truth, Samuel had confessed later, that he discovered the papers by accident while playing in the woods, had kept them secret because he thought they might be important someday. But it was a truth Henrik could live with, and sometimes that was enough. The conversation with Margaret Collins, the territorial education supervisor, led to bigger changes. Within days, Cassie found herself appointed as the permanent teacher for Lawless Gap, replacing Miss Phillips, who had mysteriously decided that California offered better opportunities. Her first day teaching was a revelation. 23 children filled the small schoolhouse, their faces bright with curiosity and hope. At the back sat Rose Martinez, the seamstress from San Antonio, who'd arrived on the same train that had brought the federal marshal. Rose had stepped off the platform to find her intended groom vanished, and her prospects bleak, but unlike Cassie's arrival, this story had unfolded differently. The women of Lawless Gap, led by Martha Beckett and Mrs. Henderson, had rallied around the abandoned bride with surprising warmth. We learned something from watching you fight, Martha had explained when she brought Rose to the schoolhouse. Learned that maybe we ought to be catching people when they fall instead of kicking them while they're down. But not everyone in town had embraced the changes. A group of men led by Cal Brennan, one of Harlan's former associates, had been vocal about their displeasure with having foreign women influencing their children. The confrontation came 3 weeks into the school term when Brennan and 5 others marched into the schoolhouse during lessons. This has gone on long enough. Brennan announced, his voice carrying the particular arrogance of men who believed the world owed them deference. We don't want our children taught by women of questionable character and foreign breeding. The children pressed closer to Cassie's desk, frightened by the angry voices. Rose stood protectively near the younger students, her face pale but determined. "What exactly is your complaint, Mr. Brennan?" Cassie asked calmly. "My complaint is that you're filling these children's heads with ideas above their station, teaching them to question their betters, to think they're entitled to things they haven't earned. I'm teaching them to read and write and think for themselves. If that threatens you, perhaps you should examine why." Brennan's face flushed red. "Don't get smart with me, woman. We know what you are, a troublemaker who destroyed a good man's reputation with lies and false accusations. Dexter Harlan destroyed his own reputation by murdering innocent people. I simply made sure the truth came to light. Your truth. Your version of events." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something menacing. "Maybe it's time this town heard some other truths. About what kind of woman corresponds with strange men, travels across the country to marry sight unseen, causes nothing but trouble wherever she goes." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Cassie could see the other men nodding, their faces set in the kind of righteous anger that preceded violence. She thought of her father, of the mob that had killed him for standing up to powerful men with ugly secrets. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. Mr. Brennan. The voice belonged to Silas, who appeared in the doorway with Marshal Bradley and 3 other men, townspeople who'd grown tired of bullies determining their community's character. "This is a private conversation, Beckett. Nothing's private when you're threatening my wife and terrorizing children." Silas stepped fully into the room, his presence filling the space. "I think you gentlemen should leave." "Or what?" "Or we'll discuss your objections with the territorial authorities." I'm sure they'd be interested to hear about your business dealings with Harlan, your role in intimidating witnesses, your attempts to obstruct justice." The men exchanged uncertain glances. Their bravado was evaporating in the face of actual consequences. "This isn't over," Brennan muttered, but he was already backing toward the door. "Yes," Cassie said quietly, "it is." After they left, she turned to address her students' children, who just witnessed adults behaving badly, who needed to understand that such behavior wasn't normal or acceptable. Sometimes, she told them, people get angry when the world changes in ways they don't like. They try to blame that anger on others instead of looking at themselves. But change isn't something to fear, it's something to embrace, to learn from, to help guide in positive directions. A hand shot up from the middle row, Emma bright-eyed and eager. "Mama Cassie, does that mean we're changing too?" "We're all changing, sweetheart. Every day in small ways and big ones. The question is whether we change for the better or let fear make us worse." 6 months later, Cassie stood on the platform where her journey had begun, but everything had transformed. She was waiting for another train, but not to leave. The Territorial Education Board was sending more supplies, more books, recognition that Lawless Gap had become a model for other rural communities. The town itself looked different too. New buildings were going up, new families arriving, drawn by reports of a place where people looked out for each other instead of turning away from those in need. Mrs. Beckett. Mrs. Henderson approached with her usual warm smile, carrying a basket for the school lunch program. "The Ladies' Auxiliary wanted to thank you again for the literacy classes. My sister-in-law is reading novels now, can you imagine?" It was a small thing, but it represented something larger, a community learning to value education opportunity. The kind of growth that came from helping people reach their potential instead of keeping them down. The train whistle sounded in the distance, and Cassie felt the familiar flutter of anticipation. But this time, she wasn't afraid of what might be coming. "Mama Cassie." Emma's voice rang out, and Cassie turned to see her running across the platform, school bag bouncing against her hip. Samuel followed at his own pace, no longer the silent, traumatized boy she'd first met, but someone who spoke his mind and stood up for others. "The supplies are here," Emma announced breathlessly. And there he was, Silas, steady and reliable. As always, but with something new in his eyes when he looked at her. Something that had grown over the months, from respect to genuine affection, maybe even love. Their marriage had evolved from necessity to partnership, to something deeper. They talked now, shared decisions, supported each other through daily challenges. And sometimes, late at night when the children were asleep, she caught him looking at her with an expression that made her think about possibilities she'd stopped allowing herself to imagine. The train pulled into the station with its familiar hiss of steam and grinding wheels. As passengers disembarked, Cassie thought about her own arrival. How frightened she'd been, how certain she'd made a terrible mistake. Most of the passengers were the usual mix of travelers and freight workers. But one figure caught her attention, a young woman about Emma's age, traveling alone, clutching a carpet bag, and looking around with the particular desperation of someone who had nowhere else to go. Another mail-order bride, Cassie realized with a pang of recognition. She could see it in the woman's posture, in the careful way she held herself, in the mixture of hope and terror in her dark eyes. The woman was slight where Cassie was substantial Mexican, where Cassie was Irish-German. But the essential loneliness was identical. She stood there as the crowd dispersed, clearly waiting for someone who wasn't coming. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Silas asked quietly. "That depends. What do you think I'm thinking?" "That someone ought to help that young lady. That someone ought to make sure she doesn't spend her first night in town alone and afraid." Cassie smiled, remembering why she'd fallen for this quiet, decent man. "I was thinking exactly that." But as they approached the waiting woman, Cassie heard voices from behind them, familiar voices, angry and getting louder. "There she is." Cal Brennan was saying to his companions. Another one of them foreign women come to corrupt our town with their strange ways. The group of men had grown since their confrontation at the schoolhouse, feeding on resentment and the kind of fear that came from watching their world change faster than they could adapt. They moved across the platform like a pack, their intentions clear. The young woman, Rose Martinez, according to the papers she clutched, looked up as they approached her face, going pale with recognition of the threat. Miss Brennan said with false politeness, "I think there's been a mistake. This town doesn't need any more of your kind." "What kind is that?" Cassie asked, stepping between them. "Troublemakers, foreign agitators, women who don't know their place." "And what place is that, Mr. Brennan?" His face flushed red. "Silent, obedient, not stirring up decent folks with ideas above their station." Rose looked confused and frightened, clearly not understanding what she'd walked into. But Cassie understood perfectly. This was the same fear that had driven the harassment of her own family, the same small-minded cruelty that preferred to tear down rather than build up. "Miss Martinez," she said gently, "I'm Cassie Beckett. This is my husband Silas and our children. Would you like to come home with us while you get your bearings?" "She's not going anywhere with you," Brennan snarled. "We're putting her right back on that train." "On whose authority?" "On the authority of decent people who are tired of watching this town go to hell." That's when Marshal Bradley stepped out of the crowd, his federal badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "Gentlemen, is there a problem here?" The men shifted uncomfortably. Federal authority still carried weight, even with those who'd grown bold in their bigotry. "No problem, Marshal," Brennan said carefully. "Just welcoming our newest visitor." Didn't sound much like a welcome from where I was standing. Bradley looked at Rose with professional courtesy. "Miss, are these men bothering you?" Rose found her voice small but determined. "See, yes, Marshal, they are." "Well then, I suggest you gentlemen find somewhere else to conduct your business." His hand rested casually on his gun belt. "This lady is under federal protection as a legal immigrant and mail-order bride. Anyone who interferes with her rights will answer to territorial authorities." The men grumbled but began to disperse, all except Brennan, who looked directly at Cassie with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You think you can change everything, make this place into something it was never meant to be. But there are still people here who remember what matters." "What matters," Cassie replied, "is treating people with dignity regardless of where they come from or what they look like. If you can't accept that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." After Brennan stalked away, Rose looked around at the group that had rallied to her defense, Cassie and Silas, the marshal, several townspeople who'd been watching from a distance, but stepped forward when needed. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why help a stranger?" "Because," Emma piped up before anyone else could answer, "that's what families do, and we're all family here." It was a child's perspective, innocent and direct, but it captured something essential about what Lawless Gap had become. A place where family wasn't just blood, but choice, where community meant looking out for each other instead of looking the other way. As they loaded Rose's belongings into the wagon alongside the school supplies, Cassie felt a familiar sense of completion. This was how it was supposed to work, people, catching those who fell, offering second chances, building something better together. "Are you a teacher too?" Rose asked as they drove toward the farm. "I am now," Cassie said. "But I started out just like you, a woman looking for a new beginning who found more than she bargained for." "Is this a good place for new beginnings?" Cassie looked around at the town that had once seemed so hostile at the landscape, that had felt like the edge of the world. Now she saw possibility everywhere in the school, where children were learning to read, in the women's auxiliary, that was bringing literacy to adults, in the simple fact that a community could change when good people decided to act on their conscience. "It can be," she said, "if you're willing to work for it." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Cassie and Silas, Emma and Samuel, and their newest guest Rose told them her story. She'd been a seamstress in San Antonio, supporting her elderly mother, until consumption took her. With no family left and no prospects, she'd answered William Porter's advertisement for a wife, using her last dollars to travel north to Lawless Gap. "He never showed," she said quietly. "The station master said he'd changed his mind, left town this morning." "His loss," Emma declared with the fierce loyalty of childhood. "We'll find you a better husband. Won't we, Mama Cassie?" "We'll find Rose whatever she needs to be happy," Cassie said diplomatically. "Whether that's a husband, a job, or just a place to belong." "What I need," Rose said carefully, "is work. I'm good with a needle, and I heard there might be opportunities for seamstresses here." "More than opportunities," Silas said. "The general store's been looking for someone to handle alterations and mending. And Mrs. Collins mentioned they want to add domestic skills to the school curriculum." Over the following days, Rose settled into the rhythm of their household with surprising ease. She was quiet where Cassie was outspoken, gentle where Cassie was fierce, but they complemented each other in ways neither had expected. Rose's skill with needle and thread proved invaluable, not just for the practical work of keeping clothes mended, but for teaching the older girls at school skills they'd need as wives and mothers. But the real test came 2 weeks later, when Cal Brennan made his final play for control of the town's direction. He'd been building support among the more conservative elements, playing on fears about changing times and foreign influences. His message was simple. Lawless Gap was losing its character, becoming something unrecognizable, and decent folks needed to take action before it was too late. The confrontation came during the monthly town meeting held in the church, since it was the only building large enough to accommodate everyone. Brennan and his supporters packed the front rows, their faces set in the kind of righteous anger that had preceded violence throughout history. "We need to talk about the direction this town is heading," Brennan announced when Mayor Thompson called for new business. "About the kinds of people we're allowing to influence our children, corrupt our values." He looked directly at Cassie as he spoke, making his target clear. "My children are getting a fine education," Martha Beckett said from the middle of the room. "Better than they ever got before Mrs. Beckett started teaching." "Education," Brennan spat. "Is that what you call filling their heads with ideas about equality and justice, teaching them to question their betters?" "I call it teaching them to think for themselves," Cassie replied, standing slowly. "To read and write and understand the world around them. If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why." "What threatens me is watching this town turn into something it was never meant to be. We were a decent, God-fearing community before you people arrived with your foreign ways and radical ideas." "What radical ideas would those be?" "That children deserve an education, that people should be judged by their character rather than their birthplace, that a community should help those in need." The room was quiet now, everyone listening, sensing that this moment would determine what kind of place Lawless Gap would become. "The radical idea," Brennan said, his voice rising, "that women like you, fat, unmarried foreign, should have any say in how decent people live their lives." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Cassie felt the familiar sting of words, meant to wound, to reduce her to nothing more than the sum of her perceived flaws. But she also felt something else, the strength that came from knowing her worth wasn't determined by other people's cruelty. "You're right," she said calmly. "I am fat. I was unmarried when I arrived here, though I'm not now. And my family came from Ireland and Germany, so I suppose that makes me foreign by your definition." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who'd become her neighbors, her friends, her community. "But I'm also the woman who exposed Dexter Harlan's crimes and brought justice to this town. I'm the teacher who's helped your children learn to read and write. I'm the person who's organized food drives for struggling families and literacy classes for adults who never had the chance to learn." She paused, letting her words sink in. "If that's what you call foreign influence, then I'm proud to be foreign. If that's what you call radical ideas, then I'm proud to be radical. And if you can't accept that kind of person in your community, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, people began to stand. Martha Beckett first, then Mrs. Henderson, then Henrik the blacksmith, then others, one by one, until most of the room was on its feet in silent support. Brennan looked around at the faces surrounding him, saw his support crumbling, and made one final, desperate play. "You're all making a mistake," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're choosing strangers over neighbors, foreigners over your own kind. You'll regret this." "The only regret," Mayor Thompson said quietly, "would be letting fear and hatred determine our community's character. Mrs. Beckett, Miss Martinez, you have the full support of this town council and the vast majority of our citizens." As the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, people approaching Cassie and Rose with words of support and encouragement, Brennan and his few remaining followers slipped out into the night. They would cause no more trouble. Some would leave town entirely. Others would eventually make their peace with the changes, but their power to intimidate and exclude was broken. Later, as they walked home under a sky brilliant with stars, Rose took Cassie's arm. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what? For showing me what courage looks like. For proving that one person can make a difference." "One person can start the change," Cassie corrected. "But it takes a whole community to make it last." A year later, Cassie stood before her classroom, looking out at faces that reflected the changes in Lawless Gap. There were the original students, Emma and Samuel among them, but also newer additions. Children of families drawn by reports of a town where education was valued, where people of all backgrounds were welcome, where community meant something more than mere proximity. At the back of the room sat Rose, no longer the frightened young woman who'd stepped off the train, but someone who'd found her place and purpose. She'd married Jacob Mills, the widowed blacksmith who'd taken over Henrik's shop when the old Norwegian had decided to move to California to be with his grandchildren. It was a good match, two quiet souls who'd found happiness in simple companionship and shared work. "Mrs. Beckett." A voice called from the doorway, and Cassie turned to see Marshall Bradley with a telegram in his hand. This just came in from the territorial capital. She read it quickly, her eyes widening with each line. Then she looked up at the expectant faces surrounding her. Her students rose, several parents who'd gathered for the end-of-term celebration. "It's from the territorial governor," she announced. "Lawless Gap has been selected as the site for the territory's first teacher training college. They want to use our methods as a model for other rural communities." The room erupted in cheers and applause. It was recognition not just for what they'd accomplished, but for what they represented, proof that a community could transform itself through education, compassion, and the simple decision to treat people with dignity. But the real celebration came that evening as the extended family that had grown around the Beckett household gathered for dinner. Silas had built additions to the house over the months, expanding it to accommodate not just Rose and Jacob when they visited, but any of the other lost souls who found their way to their door. "Remember when you first arrived?" Emma asked as they sat around the table. "When those mean people said all those awful things?" "I remember," Cassie replied. "Are you glad you stayed?" Cassie looked around the table at the faces surrounding her. Silas, weathered and steady, his love for her evident in every glance. Emma and Samuel, no longer the traumatized children she'd first met, but confident young people ready to take on the world. Rose and Jacob, building their own quiet happiness. The various neighbors and friends who'd become part of their chosen family. "I'm glad I stayed," she said. "But more than that, I'm glad you all let me belong." "You didn't just belong. Samuel said with the wisdom of someone older than his 9 years. You made belonging possible for everyone else. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Cassie and Silas stood on the porch, looking out over the land that had become truly home. In the distance, the lights of Lawless Gap twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family, a dream, a life being lived with dignity and purpose. Any regrets? Silas asked, slipping his arm around her waist. None, she said without hesitation. Not a single one. Even about that first day when you were standing alone on the platform with nowhere to go. Cassie thought about that moment, the fear, the humiliation, the terrible certainty that she'd made a mistake she couldn't undo. Then she thought about everything that had followed the struggle, the growth, the gradual transformation of both herself and the community around her. Especially not about that first day, she said. That's when everything really began. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. But below, in the small circle of light, cast by their porch lamp, love had taken root and flourished in the most unlikely soil. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected and ridiculed had become the heart of a community. The woman who'd been called fat, foreign, and unmarriageable had found love, purpose, and a family that chose her as surely as she'd chosen them. It was, Cassie thought, as she watched the last lights go out in town, a much better story than the one she'd started with. And the best part was that it was still being written one day at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one life at a time. In the end, that was how all the best stories began, not with perfection, but with the simple decision to keep going, to keep growing, to keep believing that tomorrow could be better than today. And in Lawless Gap, it always was. Your papa's bringing the wagon, Cassie said, catching the little girl in a hug.